So my case today, as soon as I saw this come up, was I'm here to talk to you about operational studies because I repeatedly talk about operational studies of the First World War. It is surprisingly one of the first things to drop away, I find, when you study the war, the actual conduct of the war. We quickly understand it, we quickly blame Haig for being a moron, and we quickly move on, job done. And it's just simply not the case. The last 30 or 40 years in operational studies has really given us a wealth of knowledge about how the war was conducted. So now we understand the process. There was a process of moving from wanting to wheel your guns in line with your infantry and fire at things you can see and losing all your guns in the process because they're doing the same thing, to the very complex and interconnected weapon systems applied on the battlefields of 1918. Though we have really come to understand that you can't send your infantry forward without an artillery barrage to protect them. If even just using a small battle like Hamel, which I'm sure your ears are bleeding from having heard about last week, we understand that there is an artillery barrage, there's 54 tanks, there are supply tanks, there's infantry, but there's rifle grenades and machine guns and Vickers machine guns behind the lines, and it's a huge interconnected thing which was invented by John Monash, and my job is done. That's not the case either. That's the reason why we need to study these operations and understand it more. I was in the galleries at work the other day, and I was giving a pop-up talk that devolved to me and another guy asking me questions about Monash, and he knew very complicated things about how Monash applied a weapon system and how he invented this weapon system in order to save Australian lives on the Western Front. And it was sort of okay, but it was so epically wrong, which is the technical term for it. And it's really hard as a historian at the War Memorial to be going, no, that's not quite right either. This is our job, Aaron. Not quite. So I'm very passionate about getting this right, and I'm very adamant that we do not know everything about it. We approach looking at 1914 and understand what people don't know. We approach 1918 and we look at what they do know, and we can have very intelligent conversations about the speed of your artillery barrage or how many tanks you have available, and the process of standardising your ammunition. But what we don't really understand is the process where one turns into the other still. And that is a huge, huge volume of work to be done on that. My first serious study in the First World War has been on Posier, and looking at particularly the role of infantry as a weapon on a mechanised battlefield. So all of this weaponry, I'm sure we know here, all of this stuff, the aircraft, the artillery, it's all to keep your infantry alive, because you can obliterate the ground, but until your men are on it, you don't own it. And so everything revolves around these infantry, and what can they do if with their hats and their rifles and their bayonet and a couple of bombs in their pocket, they can live for approximately half a second on a battlefield under a barrage. And the mistakes that are being made in trying to learn how to get them where they're going is really important. Posier, they don't know what they're doing. The Australians don't know what they're doing. The British on the either side of them really don't have much of an idea of what they're doing. They're applying a rudimentary barrage. They don't have extra firepower in terms of tanks. They are still, they deploy 7 trench mortars on the first day, and 7 of them fired 1 round, and they hoped that it was to good effect. That's the report on it. They're sending their Vickers guns forward. There's all sorts of complicated things going on, and it's really hard to then apply that to the rest of the war. One of the other things that is really important, I think, that Damien is going to run into is the role of commanders in all of this, because someone is deciding to not send the trench mortars far forward enough to get more than 7 rounds away. And someone has decided to send their Vickers guns forward, and then at some point in the war, someone decides to bring them back and put them in the artillery barrage. There's all sorts of decisions that are being made. Haig is not making those decisions. Haig is on his own learning curve. And we talk about learning curves, we talk about this process, but we don't understand how it works at all. I don't understand how it works at all. I can just tell you where it doesn't work. It doesn't work at Poziere. Poziere is bad news. William Birdwood is worse news. Yeah, so that's my argument today, I think, is that if we can look at these things in concert with each other, I can now tell you that Poziere is a failure. There are parts of it that succeed. We know they capture the village on the first day. I can then tell you that they don't apply their artillery in any useful fashion for the remainder of their time on Poziere Ridge. And in fact, friendly fire is responsible for a significant, very significant portion of the casualties taken by Australians as a result, a direct line result of the Australian-laid barrage plans. They actually require the 50th Battalion to get up out of their trenches, move back 500 yards, apply an artillery barrage to where they just were, and then go back and recapture the ground they were just in at least twice, which is insanity. My next plan then is to move forward. This talk is titled Bullecourt and the Battles, because that is the only way we can do this sort of study. Bullecourt, we know, is a failure, but it's not a failure for the same reason that the attacks on Meleah Farm is a failure. That's for sure. Nobody ever puts Meleah Farm in orders where, like, as an objective. Meleah Farm doesn't actually appear. Nobody's trying to capture it. We know they're trying to capture Bullecourt, and we know it fails. And so we need to tease out the reasons for why that one fails. And then that is not going to explain anything either, probably. Because the next time they go into battle, that succeeds. Why? Which bit makes it work? Which bit makes it fail? Is it literally just that they... is it just that take their tanks, they take the artillery away and put the tanks in? That's what we say about Bullecourt. Is that the case? I don't know. Corps commanders write orders and they pass it on to their brigade commanders. The brigade commanders take those, interpret them in two different ways, pass it on to their battalion commanders. Battalion commanders take that, and sometimes the barrage is so bad they can do nothing with it. Sometimes one of them succeeds and all the rest of them fail, and then this one's attack is then fails on its own. Warfare is such a complicated business that the problem we have in trying to understand it is trying to understand all of these complications as they go on and as they move around. I study the Australians because Monash won the war. So it's the best example. But the Australians are actually an example of the British Army. They're not an Australian super force of soldiers who won the war. They're not the worst, they're not the best. I don't even know how you would begin to describe the best, but what they are is competent, and they are excellent record keepers. So we can have a look. For Meleah Farm, we have 10,000 messages written in the field of battle. So I can tell you where they were supposed to leave their greatcoats on the 22nd of July as they moved into the front line, which is at the entrance of Centre Way. There's all sorts of things you can find out. We can't do that for a lot of British battalions on the Western Front, but we can take the Australians and look at the diversity of approach and look at the various things that all the different brigade commanders did, for example, all the different battalion commanders did, the way the artillery was applied at corps level in all these different ways, and extrapolate that to the way the British Army worked. The Australians aren't inventing stuff. Monash isn't inventing anything. He's going out, he's finding ideas, and he's bringing them back, and he's putting it together, just like Curry is, just like Maxey is, just like all sorts of commanders all along the front are doing. But we've got the detail to really dig into how that worked and who made it work and where these learning and developing processes arise from. And that's why we should still be doing operational history.